Have you ever heard of the curse of the eighth decade? Now, I hadn't heard about it until today when I randomly came across it, and it is fascinating and it's eerie. It's sort of a biblical curse that many in Israel are aware of. In fact, Prime Ministers Ehud Barak, Naftali Bennett, and Benjamin Netanyahu have all brought it up in various speeches. Now, the theory is that no kingdom of Israel can last beyond its eighth decade. The two previous kingdoms of Israel fell at around 80 years of existence, and now that Israel is in its 75th year, the curse would bring about the end of the nation within the next 5 years. Now, I want to read to you from this piece. This is written by Menachem Rahat for a Jerusalem-based organization called Mizrahi World Movement, which is a very religious Zionist movement, but he explains a bit of this curse of the eighth decade, which is so interesting. Now, of course, this is sort of mythical in a lot of ways. This is not prophecy so much. This is, it's kind of a mythical thing. So, whether you believe this or not, it's still interesting, and we'll see what this means for the state of Israel and how this plays in. So, the state of Israel, now in its eighth decade of life and about to celebrate its 75th birthday, is today closer than ever before the danger of fratricidal war, each man against his brother. This is the moment to learn from history before we destroy ourselves through the fire of hate. Now, this was written maybe a year ago, yeah, it must have been. This is not recent. This is not a totally recent piece. So it says, we have much to learn from history. Twice before there existed here in the land of Israel sovereign Jewish kingdoms, and at the beginning of the collapse of both kingdoms began in the eighth decade of their existence. So the eighth decade would be when you're in your 70s. That's when you're in your eighth decade. So you would never see 80 is what this prophecy says. This prophecy or this curse. This curse is that the land of Israel cannot remain a Jewish nation. They just will never see their 80th birthday as a nation, as a Jewish nation. So both kingdoms existed for about 220 years, but the beginning of their end sprouted with incredible timing in the eighth decade of their sovereignty. It is the duty of Israelis here and now to ensure that the situation here does not become a rerun of a terrible movie we've seen twice before. So even though those nations existed for 220 years, they really ended or shifted, or things really, really changed, and they no longer were that sovereign nation they thought they were going to be once they hit about 80 years old. And here's Israel today at 75 years. And I think many of us are seeing the events that are happening now and thinking, yeah, there is a possibility that in this next 5 years, the entire ideology of what that land is supposed to be, especially to people like Netanyahu, might actually disappear when there's a two-state solution that could cause an end to the kingdom in the visionment that many in the kingdom have. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But he goes on and he talks about the first Jewish state. So he says the first Jewish state, founded by King David, accomplished phenomenal achievements and survived united for 80 years. In the 81st year, due to internal conflicts, the kingdom of the house of David disintegrated into the separate kingdoms of Yehuda and Yisrael, and so began its fall. So even though the nation remained intact, as a nation, it still in its 81st year saw a division, and that division ultimately led to the ultimate demise of the nation, which happened about 100 years or 150 years later. In the process, we lost millions of our brothers, the members of the 10 tribes, who, according to Rabbi Akiva, will not return in the future. So this is when the 10 tribes of Israel were lost, the kingdom disintegrated, and that happened in its 81st year of existence, or 80th year, 81st year. The second Jewish state was the Hasmonean kingdom during the Second Temple era. It existed for 77 years as a united and sovereign kingdom. In the eighth decade of its life, the kingdom was torn apart by infighting, which led the representatives of the two camps claiming the crown to approach Pompey in Syria, even one begging him to agree to make them vassals of Rome. And so the sovereign Hasmonean state became a degraded protectorate state of Rome, devoid of proud Jewish sovereignty. So at 77 years, that nation fell and became part of Rome, and that was the end of that. So there's this thinking that the same thing will happen the third time around. The establishment of the state of Israel 75 years ago is the third attempt to overcome the curse of the eighth decade, which defeated the two previous Jewish states. We're currently in the midst of our third opportunity, but it is uncertain whether we will survive it. Before our eyes, we are witnessing fratricidal hatred, and now it really doesn't matter who started it, because both sides bear equal responsibility for the terrible social chaos that is eating us apart. Just as Bourguiba predicted, all the warning signs of a national catastrophe are flashing red and don't under any circumstances count on the possibility of a fourth chance. Small comfort. Now, then he goes on and says, well, but we're not the only ones who've suffered this curse. There have been many other nations who have suffered this curse as well. And he's going to go through them. And I think this is like a telltale if this is, if you believe in this, and which many of the Israeli politicians do. They talk about this in their speeches. As I mentioned, the prime ministers, they bring it up. Although some people say, well, they just bring it up because they're trying to scaremonger all of the Israeli people to not turn against the state, we can't have any infighting. Don't turn against us. Don't question us, because if you do, you know what's going to happen. There's going to be the fall. We won't make it out of that eighth decade curse. So some of the politicians, they think, use it, as a way to keep people from questioning the establishment. But it is something that Israeli politicians talk quite a bit about. It is something that, like, these religious Zionists talk about. It's on the minds of many in Israel, and I just find it the most fascinating thing. I'd never heard about it before today. But here's what they say about other nations who've experienced the same curse. So he says, small comfort can be found in the fact that other nations have also experienced the curse of the eighth decade in a very painful way. The bloody American Civil War broke out 85 years after the adoption of the Constitution. Oh, what luck. It happened to them in the ninth decade, he says. Italy became fascist, and Germany became a Nazi terrorist state in the eighth decade after each nation's unification. The Third Republic of France, founded in 1871, surrendered to the Nazi boot in 1940 in its eighth decade, while the communist monster that was born in the October Revolution of 1917 began to disintegrate in the 1980s and was finally shattered into pieces 74 years after its founding in 1991. So that's interesting. It's not just these ancient kingdoms of Israel that suffer this 80-year fate, but it's these other nations as well, that something happens at 80 years that causes change, radical change, even demise. And he goes on to address this. He says, what is the spell that brings crisis and breaks up kingdoms in a nation's eighth decade? What is it that causes this? Historians point to several factors whose cumulative impact can lead to a crisis. One explanation posits that a nation's eighth decade ushers in the era of its third generation. And I have kind of a joke that goes with this, but it says, while the first and second generations are acutely aware of the great responsibility placed upon their shoulders and are prepared to sacrifice and make major concessions for the good of the nation, the members of the third generation take the existence of the nation for granted and focus on their faction's narrow agenda. Yeah. I always say that, it's the grandfather who he starts the company, he builds the company and turns it into something mighty and great. And he passes it to his son, and his son takes what his father made and made it bigger and better. We see this all the time. The son then turns it into an even bigger conglomerate, into a bigger, massive empire of a corporation. And then the grandson is just spinning around in his Ferraris and just snorting coke and like blowing all the money and wasting everything because he was born entitled, did not see his dad work. His dad was rich by the time he was born, and he was just born into wealth, and he's just like lazy and comfortable and everything's fine, and he's just snorting coke and driving around as fast as he can in his Ferraris. That is what we see a lot when it comes to really not just nations, as they're saying, as these historians point out, but also to individual families. This often happens to immigrant families. You see, the immigrant comes to America, works really, really hard, works in some really some grimy job in the dirt, doing the grime work. And they hope that their child is going to go off to college, go to school and get a better job. And that kid goes and works hard and and becomes, an accountant or a lawyer or something. And then the third kid usually has a radical shift, and they're often, in this case, they're not snorting coke and riding around their Ferraris, but they change their politics by the time they get to that third generation. You see that a lot. The third generation, their politics will shift, and they'll take for granted the hard work that their parent and their grandparent went through to give them a better life in a new nation, and they start wanting a lot of things to be given to them. It's a very different mentality what happens. So this isn't just what happens to nation, but it happens to individuals, it happens to companies. And this is what they're saying, is that third generation, that a generation is about 40 years. And so every 40 years, you get a new group of people that are in power that they don't remember much from the 40 years before them. And by the time you get to that third 40-year mark, things just start to go haywire. This goes on to say, this is exactly what is happening today. The existence of the state is self-evident, even if there are serious threats from the outside, murderous Palestinian terrorism, Hezbollah missiles, Iranian nukes, and the like. With Hashim's kindness, we will overcome all of these threats. On the other hand, the tsunami of hatred and factionalism may cause the vision of the third temple to collapse from within in the spirit of Bourguiba's twisted vision. So again, that was written by a very religious Zionist person inside of a religious Zionist organization based in Jerusalem. So they have, they have very much visions of Israel being the entire land, and this curse could come into effect. I mean, quite frankly, I think it's very possible that what we're seeing now around the world is we're seeing a much stronger push for a two-state solution than we'd seen before. You've got Joe Biden continually pushing for it, even though Netanyahu has got different ideas, and Joe Biden's having to tell Netanyahu it's a bad idea to annex Gaza. It's a bad idea to annex the West Bank. You can't do this. We want a two-state solution, a place for the Palestinians where they can thrive. You can't do this. And we're seeing even Elon Musk, he came back from his trip, and what he's saying is he wants to see a two-state, not that he has much power, but, it's still, he has a lot of control over a lot of the narrative, and that's what Israel was afraid of, and that's why they sent him out there. And they see that people are calling for a two-state solution. People are turning against Israel, and they're saying, wow, you are committing some real serious crimes, some egregious